"Miss John," he whispered. "Please come with me immediately." I opened my mouth to ask why, but his grip tightened, pressing into bone. He cast a quick glance over his shoulder. Julian was watching us from the gravel path. My brother's eyes were narrowed and his phone was suddenly lowered. "There is something important I need to show you," Harrison muttered. "Do not tell your parents. Do not tell your brother. Just get in your car and drive to my office." He released my arm and walked away, blending into the sea of black suits. My chest tightened. The dry wind felt suddenly suffocating. I kept my head down and walked straight to my old truck. I ignored my mother waving from the window of her hired car. I emerged onto the highway, leaving the cemetery behind as the sun dipped behind the jagged mesa. The drive to Harrison's firm took 20 minutes. The building sat on the quiet edge of Albuquerque, surrounded by empty asphalt and dying scrub brush. The overhead street lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the brick facade. Every window was dark except for a dim amber glow in the lobby. I parked and stepped out into the cooling evening air. My boots crunched against the loose gravel. That was when I saw him. A tall silhouette stood in the recessed doorway of the firm. He was smoking a cigarette. The brief orange flare illuminated a rugged face I had never seen before. He did not move to open the door. He just stood in the dark, exhaling a slow breath of smoke, waiting specifically for me. The stranger did not flinch as I approached. He took one final drag from his cigarette, the ember illuminating a scar near his jawline. He dropped the butt onto the concrete and crushed it under the heel of his boot. He reached for the heavy glass door, pulling it open. The hinges groaned in the quiet night. "You are Mabel," he said. His voice was low, carrying the rough texture of crushed gravel. I stopped at the threshold. My grip tightened on the strap of my purse. I did not confirm my name. I just stared at him, calculating the distance back to my truck. Harrison stepped into the lobby from the dark hallway. He looked older than he had at the cemetery, his shoulder sagging under an invisible weight. "It is safe, Mabel," Harrison said. "Please come inside. We do not have much time." I stepped through the door. Harrison immediately turned the deadbolt. The metallic click echoed in the empty reception area. He led us down a narrow corridor lined with framed diplomas and overflowing filing cabinets. We entered a windowless conference room. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. The stranger took a seat across from me. He rested his elbows on the polished mahogany table. "My name is Alias Thorne," he said. "I am a private investigator. Your grandmother hired me 3 months ago." I looked from Alias to Harrison. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Sylvia had never mentioned a private investigator. She lived a quiet, structured life, tending to her gardens and reading historical biographies. Why would my grandmother need a private investigator? I asked. My voice sounded hollow in the small room. Elias reached inside his worn leather jacket. He pulled out a thick manila folder and placed it on the table. He did not open it right away. He looked at me with a steady, unblinking gaze, because she knew she was running out of time. Elias said. He flipped the folder open. Inside was a stack of medical documents with the letterhead of an independent laboratory in Phoenix. Elias slid the top page toward me. The coroner listed the cause of death as a sudden myocardial infection. Elias continued. A heart attack. A tragic but common end for an 82-year-old woman. But your grandmother suspected her health issues were not natural. She sent me blood and hair samples weeks before she passed. I had them tested off the books. I stared at the black text on the crisp white paper. The scientific jargon blurred together until my eyes locked onto a single highlighted line. It read, "Foreign synthetic compound detected consistent with prolonged toxic exposure." The breath left my lungs. The leather tear felt like it was swallowing me. My hands turned numb. She was poisoned. I whispered. The word tasted metallic on my tongue. Slowly. Elias corrected. It was a gradual introduction of a synthetic neurotoxin. It mimics the symptoms of natural cardiac decline. Shortness of breath. Tremors. Fatigue. Someone was slipping it into her food or her daily supplements. Someone who had regular access to her kitchen. The faces of my family flashed through my mind. Richard carving the Sunday roast. Julian pouring her evening tea. Evelyn arranging her vitamin pill boxes with a sweet maternal smile. The image of my mother brought a sudden chill to my skin. My mind drifted backward, pulled by the gravity of a memory I had not thought about in 2 decades. I was 10 years old, standing inside Sylvia's sprawling glass greenhouse. The air was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth and crushed leaves. Sylvia wore gardening gloves stained with dark soil. She held a rare desert cactus in one hand and a sharp grafting knife in the other. A dark soft spot blemished the side of the green stem. You have to cut away the rot. Relatable, she told me. Her voice was firm but gentle. She pressed the blade into the plant, slicing deep into the healthy tissue to remove the infection. I winced, asking if it hurt the plant to lose so much of itself. Sylvia set the knife down and looked at me. Even if the rot reaches the main stem, you must remove it. If you hesitate, the infection spreads. Otherwise the whole plant dies. You save what you can, and you discard the rest without regret. Sitting in the cold conference room, the meaning of her words settled heavily over me. My family was the rot. Sylvia had known it. She had watched the infection spread through her son and then to his wife and finally to her grandson. If she knew, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, why did she not go to the police? Because proving it would require a lengthy investigation. Harrison intervened. He folded his hands on the table. Your father has expensive lawyers. They would drag it out in court, claim the lab results were flawed, or blame a careless caregiver. Sylvia wanted to ensure they faced justice. But she also wanted to protect her legacy. She wanted to protect you. Harrison stood up and walked to a small safe in the corner of the room. Sylvia orchestrated a legal trap, he explained over his shoulder. She restructured her entire estate. But she did not finish the final step before the poison took her. To activate the mechanism, we need 2 things. A physical brass key and a coded journal where she documented every symptom, every meal, and every interaction with your family. Where are they? I asked. Hidden on her estate. Elias answered. She told me she buried them where only you would understand to look. She said you speak the same language she did. Elias leaned closer, his rugged face turning grim. You need to understand what you are up against. Relatable. Your father is loud and your brother is desperate. But Evelyn is the architect. She is the one pulling the strings. She plays the role of the grieving peacemaker. But she is a psychological manipulator. She orchestrates the chaos and watches from the sidelines while others take the fall. I nodded slowly. The pieces of my childhood snapped into a horrifying alignment. Evelyn never raised her voice. She never threw a plate. She just whispered the right words to Richard, igniting his rage, and then comforted us when the storm passed. She was the rot at the center of the stem. Your family is millions of dollars in debt, Elias stated. Creditors are threatening to seize their assets. They need Sylvia's estate to survive. Right now, they are looking for the original property deed. If they find it, they can leverage the land. You have to find the key and the journal before they tear that property apart. My goal was set. I needed to get inside Sylvia's house. I needed to walk through the rooms she loved and find the evidence that would lock my family in a cage. I needed to do it without letting them see the truth in my eyes. Before I could form a plan, A sharp vibration rattled against the mahogany table. We all stared at my purse. I reached inside and pulled out my phone. The harsh blue light of the screen illuminated the dim room. A text message notification hovered on the lock screen. It was from my mother. I read the words twice, feeling a cold drop of sweat slide down my spine. "We are at Grandma's house." The message read, "We found something. Come over now." I looked up at Elias and Harrison. The silence in the room stretched until it felt ready to snap. They were already there. The invasion had begun. And I had to walk straight into the center of it. The desert highway stretched ahead like a fractured black ribbon cutting through the silver-illuminated dust. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck until the joints in my fingers HDHD. The text message from my mother burned a hole in my mind. The drive to Sylvia's estate usually offered a deep sense of peace. The isolated adobe house had always been a sanctuary of quiet gardens and shaded courtyards. But tonight, as I pulled through the tall wrought iron gates, the sprawling residence looked like a fortress under siege. Every light inside the house blazed against the dark New Mexico sky. Frantic shadows darted back and forth across the drawn linen curtains. They were searching the property. I shifted the truck into park and cut the engine. I took a slow breath, inhaling the dry sage and cooling sand. I locked away the terror Elias and Harrison had just planted in my chest. I had to become the quiet, compliant, fragile daughter my family expected. I pushed the heavy oak front door open. The hinges squeaked into the cavernous foyer. The familiar, comforting scent of Sylvia's lavender soap was entirely overpowered by the sharp odor of sweat, spilled scotch, and frantic energy. I walked down the salt tile hallway toward the study. The devastation was breathtaking. Books were yanked from the tall mahogany shelves. Their spines cracked against the floor. Piles of sensitive financial records covered the antique Persian rug. Wooden drawers hung open, their private contents dumped ruthlessly across the leather armchair where Sylvia used to sit and read. Richard stood near the stone fireplace. His face was flushed red. He was flipping through a stack of bank statements with frantic, jerky movements. Julian was on his knees near the wooden desk, physically tearing apart a metal filing cabinet. Evelyn stood in the center of the room. When she heard my boots scuff against the tiles, the predatory tension vanished from her posture in an instant. It was terrifying to witness. She smoothed the front of her designer silk blouse and walked toward me. Her features softened, shifting into a flawless portrait of maternal concern. She reached out, wrapping her cool, slender fingers around my wrists. "Murable. Sweetheart," she said. Her voice dropped to a soft, comforting register. "I am so glad you are here. We did not want to worry you tonight of all nights, but we had to look into your grandmother's affairs." I kept my face blank. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting exhaustion. "What is going on?" I asked, infusing my tone with a deliberate tremor of confusion. Evelyn guided me to a small wooden chair near the door. "Sylvia was hiding terrible things from us," she murmured. She sighed heavily, shaking her head. "Her finances are a disaster. She owed creditors more than this estate is worth if we do not act right now. The bank will seize this house by the end of the month." Richard stepped forward. He held a thick stack of legal paper bound by a blue clip. "It is a temporary conservatorship," he said. His tone was clipped and impatient, devoid of any grief. "It grants me emergency executive rights. We can liquidate some assets to pay off the immediate liens and save the property." I looked down at the dense paragraphs of legal text he shoved into my lap. They wanted total control. If I signed that paper, I handed Richard the keys to the kingdom before the probate court even opened its doors. I did not read the words. I read the room. Richard tapped his expensive leather shoe against the tiles, radiating barely contained anger at the inconvenience of my presence. But it was Julian who commanded my true attention. My younger brother had abandoned the filing cabinet and stood near the doorway. Despite the chill of the evening air conditioning, a thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple. The collar of his expensive dress shirt was soaked. His right leg bounced in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. His tech startup was hemorrhaging capital. Elias had warned me Julian was in trouble. But the physical reality of his panic was staggering. He needed this estate to avoid a federal indictment. He desperately needed me to pick up the pen. Evelyn stroked the back of my hair. Just sign on the back page. Darling. We will handle the ugly legal mess so you can focus on grieving. I let a single tear slip down my cheek. I stared at the silver pen Richard thrust toward my face. This is too much. I whispered. I pulled my hands into my lap, refusing to touch the paper. We just buried her today. I cannot even read these words right now. My head is spinning. Richard clenched his jaw. He opened his mouth to snap at me. But Evelyn shot him a sharp silencing glare. It was the true matriarch asserting dominance without a single sound. Of course. It is too much. Evelyn cooped, her eyes never leaving my face. Take a minute. Relatable. Catch your breath. I stood up slowly, letting the legal documents slide off my lap and onto the floor. I need some air, I said. I am going to the greenhouse. No one stopped me as I walked out the back patio doors. The night air was sharp and cold. But the moment I pushed open the thick glass door of Sylvia's greenhouse, a wave of humid, suffocating heat enveloped me. The scent of damp potting soil and blooming orchids offered a momentary sanctuary from the predators inside the house. The glass walls reflected the pale moonlight, casting eerie silver patterns across the dense foliage. I moved past the rows of potted succulents and hanging ferns. My eyes scanned the dirt. Elias said. Sylvia hid the evidence where only I would understand to look. She spoke the language of plants. I walked down the central aisle until I reached the back corner. There, planted in a gigantic terracotta basin, was the century plant. The Agave americana. It stood 6 feet tall. Its thick, spiky leaves reaching outward. But the leaves were shriveled. The vibrant green had faded to a sickly, decaying brown. Shooting up from the center of the dying rosette was a towering stalk capped with withered yellow blossoms. The agave spends its entire life gathering energy. It stores water and strength for decades in the harsh desert. Then, in one spectacular display, it blooms. And immediately after producing that single life-giving flower, the mother plant dies. It sacrifices everything it has to leave behind its seeds. Sylvia knew her life was ending. She had gathered all her evidence, built her legal trap, and left behind the seeds of my protection. I dropped to my knees on the damp concrete floor. I did not bother looking in the lower wooden cabinets or behind the ceramic pots. I plunged my bare hands directly into the dark wet soil at the base of the dying agave. The dirt packed beneath my fingernails as I dug past the shallow root system. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. About 6 in down. My fingers brushed against something hard and unnatural. I clawed the dirt away, unearthing a heavy package wrapped tight in thick industrial plastic. I pulled it free and brushed the excess soil off the surface. My hands shook as I peeled back the layers of plastic. Inside lay a small black leather journal. The pages were tightly bound. Resting on top of the notebook was a solid brass key. The metal was heavy and cold against my palm. The serial numbers etched into the brass verified everything Elias had told me. It was a safe deposit key, the physical activation trigger for the blind trust. I quickly zipped the journal and the key into the hidden inner pocket of my purse. I wiped my muddy hands on my dark slacks. My heart raced with a triumphant surge of adrenaline. I had the evidence. I had the key. Now I just needed to walk back through that house. Play the grieving fool one more time and drive away. I stood up, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder. I turned toward the exit, ready to face my family. The thick glass door stood closed at the end of the long dirt aisle. As I took my first step forward, the sharp metallic snap of the heavy deadbolt echoed through the humid air. The latch clicked, locked from the outside. I froze. The shadows outside the frosted glass shifted. I was trapped. I pushed my shoulder against the thick glass pane. The heavy metal frame did not yield. I rattled the brass handle, twisting it hard to the right. But the locking mechanism held firm. Through the frosted condensation, I watched a dark shadow retreat toward the main house. The crunch of gravel faded into the night. The greenhouse climate control system hummed to life. The automated humidifiers kicked on, spraying a fine mist into the enclosed space. Without the ventilation fans running, the temperature inside the glass structure began to climb, trapping the residual heat of the desert day. It felt like breathing through a damp wool blanket. My heart thudded against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the rising tide of panic down into my stomach. Screaming would only confirm to them that I was a threat. I needed to remain the fragile sister. I retreated from the door, moving deeper into the shadows of the hanging ferns. I sat on an overturned wooden crate, hiding myself behind a row of tall fuse plants. My hands were still caked with damp soil. I pulled the black leather journal from my purse and rested it on my knees. The brass key remained safely tucked in the zippered pocket. I opened the stiff cover. Sylvia had filled the pages with her elegant left-handed script. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard gardening log. She recorded soil pH levels, watering schedules, and notes on pest control. But as I read the dates corresponding to her physical decline, the botanical metaphors revealed a chilling systematic confession. She wrote about a recurring infestation. The white aphid returns every Sunday evening, bringing sweet nectar that rots the roots. My stomach turned to ice. Evelyn always visited Sylvia on Sunday evenings. My mother prided herself on her culinary skills, always arriving with a basket of homemade lemon cakes or thermos of her special herbal tea. Evelyn was the white aphid. I turned the page, my eyes scanning the tight paragraphs. Richard is a loud storm. Sylvia had written. He thunders and breaks the weak branches. But he lacks the focus to poison the soil. He only wants the fruit. The white aphid is the one applying the blight. She smiles while she pours it. The revelation hit me with physical force. Richard was a terrifying, volatile man. But his anger was performative. He was the distraction. Evelyn was the architect. She was the one methodically measuring synthetic neurotoxins into Sylvia's meals, watching her mother-in-law consume the poison with a flawless, loving smile. Evelyn had orchestrated the entire execution while letting Richard believe he was in charge. The journal entries grew messier as Sylvia's motor skills deteriorated. I flipped to a page dated 3 weeks before her death. The focus shifted from the poison to the motive. The young sapling is dying of thirst. The entry read, "He begged for the deep well today. He cried on the patio. I told him the water stays in the earth. He looked at me with his mother's cold eyes. He provided the blight. I found the empty vials in his coat." Julian. My brother had always been the golden child, parading his tech startup across magazine covers and social media. But Elias had warned me Julian was in trouble. Sylvia's notes laid out the exact nature of his desperation. Julian was building a sprawling data center in the desert. Server farms generate extreme heat and require millions of gallons of cool water to function. Julian had secured federal funding and private investor capital based on a lie. He claimed he already owned the water rights to the vast subterranean aquifer lying directly beneath Sylvia's estate. When Sylvia refused to sign over the mineral and water rights, Julian faced federal indictment for investor fraud. He needed the estate and he needed it before the grand jury convened. Evelyn was killing Sylvia to save her son from prison. And Julian was sourcing the untraceable synthetic compounds to make it happen. They were a unified front of survival and greed. The temperature in the greenhouse crested past 100 degrees. A bead of sweat stung my eye. My lungs labored to pull oxygen from the stifling misty air. The edges of my vision began to blur. If I stayed in this humid box much longer, I would pass out from heat exhaustion. I snapped the journal shut and shoved it deep into my bag. I stood up, gripping the edge of a wooden potting table to steady my swaying legs. I took a deliberate breath, preparing to break a glass pane with a terracotta pot if necessary. Before I could reach for a planter, the heavy deadbolt clicked. The door swung outward, letting in a rush of cool, dry night air. I gasped, stumbling forward. Julian stood in the doorway. He slipped a set of silver keys into his slacks. His chest heaved slightly, and the knees of his expensive trousers were dusted with white gravel. He looked past me, his eyes darting toward the dark corners of the greenhouse. "Sorry about that," he said. His voice was too loud, vibrating with false casualness. "The latch on this door gets sticky in the humidity. I thought you walked back to the house. Are you all right?" I looked at the gravel on his knees. He had not been inside the house. He had been in the driveway. The realization crystallized in my mind. He locked me in the greenhouse to buy himself 10 uninterrupted minutes. He was searching my truck. He thought I might have found the physical property deed and hid it in my vehicle before coming inside. He was disappointed. He found nothing in the truck. So he came back to unlock the door before I panicked. It was a calculated diversion. I pressed a hand to my forehead, leaning against the door frame. I let my knees buckle just enough to sell the performance. "It is so hot in there," I whispered, forcing a weak tremor into my voice. "I think I am dizzy. I need to go home." Julian reached out to steady my arm. His grip was firm, testing my physical strength. "You look pale. Murable. Let me drive you. We can look at the conservatorship papers tomorrow." I pulled my arm away gently, keeping my head bowed. "No. I will be fine. I just need sleep. Give me the documents. I will read them in the morning when my head is clear." He stared at me for a long second, dissecting my posture, satisfied that I was just a grieving, exhausted sister. He nodded. He handed me the blue folder he had retrieved from Richard. "Take your time," Julian said smoothly. "We are family. We will figure this out together." I clutched the folder to my chest. I walked past him, crossing the dark patio and re-entering the chaotic house just long enough to tell my parents I was leaving. Evelyn offered another counterfeit display of sympathy, kissing my cheek. Her perfume smelled like vanilla and chemicals. I held my breath until I was back outside in the cold desert night. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of highway lines and adrenaline. The journal burned against my side. I knew the truth. My mother was a murderer and my brother was her accomplice. I gripped the steering wheel, mapping out my meeting with Elias and Harrison in the morning. We had the evidence. Now we just needed to figure out how to use it without tipping them off. I pulled into the parking lot of my small apartment complex. The building was quiet. The harsh yellow security lights cast long shadows across the concrete walkways. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my keys jingling in my tired hands. I stopped 3 feet from my front door. The hallway was silent, but the air felt wrong. I looked down at the threshold. Smeared across the bottom edge of my white wooden door frame was a fresh, distinct scuff mark. The dark mud was identical to the wet soil near Sylvia's driveway. I looked at the brass lock. The deadbolt was engaged, but the tiny scratch marks around the keyhole told a different story. I lowered my keys. My blood ran cold. Someone had breached my apartment while I was at the estate. And looking at the narrow gap beneath the door, where the interior hall light was completely blocked by a stationary shadow, I knew the worst truth of all. They had not left. Someone was still inside. The brass key hidden deep inside my purse felt like a block of ice against my hip. I stood frozen on the threshold of my apartment. My fingers locked around the door knob. The shadow I had seen blocking the narrow gap of light beneath the door was gone. The moment the deadbolt clicked open, the presence vanished. I pushed the wooden panel inward, the hinges moving in perfect silence. A sudden gust of cold wind swept through the living room, lifting the edges of the linen curtains. Across the dark space, the iron grating of the fire escape groaned. The heavy glass of my living room window was sliding shut. Whoever had been standing inside my home just slipped out into the night. I did not reach for the light switch. I closed the front door behind me, turning the deadbolt and sliding the chain lock into place. My breathing was shallow and erratic. I stood in the dark, letting my eyes adjust to the amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The apartment was still, but the air was ruined. The familiar, comforting scent of my home had been replaced by a sharp, foreign odor. It was the distinct aroma of citrus and cedarwood. It was Julian's expensive cologne, the same scent that had choked the air in Sylvia's devastated study hours earlier. My brother had been standing in my living room. I moved forward with slow, deliberate steps, my boots making no sound on the hardwood floor. I scanned the shadows. The invasion was intimate and terrifying. On the narrow console table near the entryway, my stack of unopened mail was scattered. A framed photograph of my college graduation had been shoved 2 in to the left, exposing a pale line of dust on the dark wood. I walked into the small kitchen. The utility drawer where I kept my spare keys and important documents sat jutting out a fraction of an inch. They had searched my sanctuary. They had rifled through my private life while I was trapped inside the sweltering heat of the greenhouse. I backed away from the kitchen and retreated down the short hallway to my bathroom. I stepped inside and locked the door. I reached into the shower stall and turned the hot water faucet on full blast. The plumbing shuddered and a deafening rush of water echoed off the porcelain tiles. Thick white steam began to fill the small room, fogging the mirror and masking any sound I made. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out the cheap prepaid burner phone Elias Thorne had handed me in his office. My thumbs shook as I pressed the small plastic buttons. I typed a single terse message. Someone was inside. Julian. 10 seconds later, the screen illuminated with an incoming call from an unknown number. I accepted the call and pressed the phone hard against my ear. "Are you safe?" Alias asked. His voice was a low, growly rasp cutting through the static. He left through the fire escape right as I unlocked the door. I whispered. He searched my drawers. He went through my mail. "Listen to me carefully, Mabel," Elias said. The tempo of his words was steady and clinical, anchoring my racing pulse. "They are not planting surveillance equipment. They do not care who you call or what you do in your free time. They are tearing your life apart looking for a piece of paper. The deed to the estate." I replied. "Yes." Alias confirmed. "Julian is cornered." I spent the afternoon digging into the shell companies funding his tech startup. He borrowed millions from private lenders who do not file civil lawsuits when they are ignored. They seize assets by force. Julian promised them the mineral rights beneath Sylvia's property as collateral. He needs the physical property deed to save his own life. Right now, you are the only obstacle standing between your brother and a shallow grave. The steam curled around my face, dampening my hair. The truth of my situation settled over my shoulders like a heavy lead apron. I was not a daughter to Richard. I was not a sister to Julian. I was a locked gate. They would tear me off the hinges if I did not step aside. "What do I do?" I asked. My voice sounded small in the humid room. You act like you notice nothing. Alias instructed. If you call the police to report a break-in, your family will know you are suspicious. They will know you are hiding something valuable. You must continue to be the naive, grieving girl they expect. Play the role. Let them think they hold all the cards while we prepare the trap. I ended the call and slipped the burner phone back into my jacket. I turned off the shower. The sudden silence in the bathroom was deafening. I wiped a circle clear on the fogged mirror and stared at my own reflection. My skin was pale. My eyes were wide and dark. I am a botanist. I spend my days observing how fragile organisms survive in harsh, unforgiving environments. I knew the physical reality of my situation. I could not win a physical confrontation against my family. Richard was a towering, ruthless man. Julian was fueled by the raw adrenaline of a hunted animal. If it came to violence, I would lose. But they were arrogant. They relied on brute force and emotional manipulation. They did not know I possessed Sylvia's coded journal. They did not know the brass key to the blind trust was sitting in the next room. I had to outsmart them. I had to use my quietness as a weapon. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped back into the dark apartment. The psychological claustrophobia was crushing. Every shadow in the corners of the room looked like a man holding his breath. Every creak of the settling floorboards sounded like a footstep approaching from behind. I forced my muscles to relax. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the small stove light, and filled a kettle with water. I performed my evening routine with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I changed into loose cotton clothes. I poured a cup of hot chamomile tea and sat on the edge of my sofa. My skin crawled with the phantom sensation of being watched. I imagined Julian sitting in a parked SUV across the street, his eyes fixed on my lit window, studying my every move. I sipped the hot liquid, keeping my expression vacant and dull. I opened a book and stared at the pages, letting my eyes glaze over without processing a single word. I was a prisoner in my own home, forced to perform for an invisible audience. Then the silence shattered. My primary cell phone rested on the wooden coffee table. The screen flashed brightly, vibrating with a harsh mechanical buzz that sent a shockwave of adrenaline straight into my veins. I set the teacup down on the saucer. The china rattled, betraying the tremor in my hands. I leaned forward and looked at the caller ID. It was Richard. I checked the digital clock on the screen. It was past midnight. My father never called me. He despised small talk, preferring to delegate all family communication to Evelyn. If Richard was calling me directly at this hour, the rules of engagement had shifted. I took a deep breath, smoothing the panic out of my throat. I swiped the green answer button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said. My voice was soft, coated in the manufactured exhaustion of a mourning daughter. There was no greeting on the other end. No counterfeit sympathy. No fake paternal warmth. The voice that came through the speaker was cold, sharp, and lethal. It was the voice of a man who had run out of patience. "Listen to me, Mabel," Richard said. The low timbre of his words carried a physical threat. "You will meet us tomorrow morning at your mother's house. You will sit at the table and you will sign the conservatorship documents. If you refuse or if you try to delay us with more of your tears, we will not wait for you." "Dad, I just need a little time to process everything," I whispered, playing the fragile part. "You have no time left," Richard snapped. "Because if you do not sign that document by noon, we will simply use the new will we found hidden in Sylvia's desk tonight. The one that cuts you out entirely." The morning sun over the Sandia Mountains offered no warmth, only a blinding, sterile light that bleached the color from the desert landscape. I drove through the raw iron gates of my parents' gated community. The neighborhood was a monument to artificial wealth. while the rest of New Mexico strictly rationed water to survive the ongoing drought. The lawns on this street were a vibrant, unnatural green. Sprinkler systems hissed in synchronized rhythm, dumping thousands of gallons of precious water onto imported turf. My parents' sprawling Mediterranean revival mansion sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. From the outside, it projected unshakable prosperity. Stucco walls, terracotta roof tiles, and an expansive circular driveway paved with imported stone. But Elias had shown me the truth in the dark hours of the early morning. This house was a hollow shell, mortgaged 3 times over. The bank owned the roof, the walls, and the manicured grass. My family was drowning in toxic debt, clinging to a lifestyle they could no longer afford. In botany, there is a specific type of parasitic vine known as the daughter. It possesses no roots of its own in the earth. Instead, it wraps itself tightly around a healthy host plant, sinking tiny biological needles into the stem to siphon away water and nutrients. The vine flourishes, growing thick and green, while the host slowly withers into dry, brittle wood. My family operated on the exact same ecological principle. They consumed. They drained. They never nurtured. They wanted the vast subterranean aquifer beneath Sylvia's land to feed Julian's failing tech startup, and they were willing to bleed my grandmother dry to get it. I parked my truck near the grand entrance and walked up the stone steps. I arranged my features into a mask of nervous exhaustion, mirroring the fragile daughter Richard had threatened over the phone. I pushed the heavy front door open. The foyer echoed with the chilled humming rush of central air conditioning. I found them in the formal dining room. Richard paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his arms crossed tight over his chest. He did not look at me when I entered. Evelyn sat at the head of the longered glass dining table. Julian was notably absent, likely coordinating the quiet panic of his impending corporate ruin. My mother wore a tailored charcoal blazer. Her posture was rigid and flawless. The maternal sweetness she had weaponized in the study the night before was entirely gone. The soft, comforting gaze had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculating stare. This was the true Evelyn, the architect of the rot. "Sit down, Mabel," she commanded. Her voice was flat and transactional. I pulled out a heavy velvet chair and sat opposite her. The glass table felt like a block of ice under my forearms. "Your father and I are tired of these delays," Evelyn continued. She folded her manicured hands over a single cream-colored folder resting in front of her. "We tried to handle this with compassion. We tried to shield you from the ugly realities of your grandmother's financial incompetence. But your stubborn refusal to sign the conservatorship has forced our hand." I kept my chin lowered, staring at the polished glass. "What does that mean?" I asked, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound authentic. Evelyn slid the cream folder across the smooth table. It stopped inches from my hands. "Open it," Richard ordered from the window. I lifted the heavy card's stock cover. Inside rested a typed legal document bearing the header of a local Albuquerque law firm. The title read, "Supersing Last Will and Testament of Sylvia John." I scanned the dense paragraphs. The legal jargon was complex, but the bottom line was glaringly simple. It revoked all prior trusts, cancelled all previous inheritance structures, and named Julian as the sole beneficiary of the entire estate, including all subterranean, mineral, and water rights. We found it hidden behind a false panel in her writing desk. Evelyn lied smoothly. "It is dated just 4 days before her tragic passing. She realized Julian possessed the business acumen to save her legacy. She knew you lacked the stomach for corporate management." I turned to the final page. My eyes locked onto the signature line. "A botanist learns to identify a plant by the minute architecture of its leaves. You study the vein patterns, the serration of the edges, The angle of the stem. Handwriting requires the exact same forensic attention. Sylvia was left-handed. She gripped a pen with a severe hook, causing her cursive loops to slant heavily toward the right side of the page. Her letters always dragged, leaving tiny pools of ink at the bottom of her vowels. The signature on this document stood perfectly upright. The pressure applied to the paper was heavy and uniform, born from a rigid right-hand grip. The loops were tight and nervous. It was a forgery. Julian had traced her name, likely using an old birthday card or a bank slip as a reference. It was a desperate, sloppy imitation. If an expert document examiner looked at this paper under a microscope, the lie would shatter in an instant. A surge of hot, biting rage flared in my chest. My mother was sitting across from me presenting a fraudulent document she had helped construct to steal my inheritance and cover up a murder. I wanted to reach across the glass table and tear the paper into shreds. I wanted to scream that I had Sylvia's journal hidden in my apartment. Instead, I swallowed the anger, forcing it deep down into my stomach. I remembered Elias's warning. I had to let them think they held all the cards. This leaves me with nothing, I whispered, staring wide-eyed at the forged signature. Evelyn leaned forward, the corners of her mouth twitching upward in a predatory smirk. It leaves you out of the estate. Yes. But we are not monsters, Mabel. We take care of our own. She opened a leather portfolio beside her and pulled out a different piece of paper. It was the temporary conservatorship document Richard had tried to force on me the previous night. Here is our offer, Evelyn stated, her tone shifting into a sharp negotiation. You sign the conservatorship right now. You waive your right to contest this new will in probate court. In exchange, your father and I will personally write you a check for $50. 000. You can take the money, go back to your plants, and live your quiet little life. And if I refuse? I asked softly. Richard stepped away from the window, casting a long shadow across the dining table. If you refuse, we submit this new will to a judge today. If you try to fight us, I will unleash a team of corporate litigators that will tie you up in depositions for the next 10 years. I will bury you in legal fees until you are forced to sell your truck and your cheap apartment just to afford a public defender. You will walk away with nothing but bankruptcy. The trap was elegantly cruel. Take a $50. 000 crumb or face total financial annihilation. They thought I was a fragile flower they could crush under a heavy boot. I let my shoulders collapse forward. I covered my face with my hands, taking a long shuddering breath to simulate a broken spirit. I let the silence stretch, filling the cold dining room with my projected defeat. I lowered my hands and looked at Evelyn with defeated eyes. I cannot think straight right now. Give me 24 hours. Just let me sleep. I will come back tomorrow morning and sign the conservatorship. I will take the check. Evelyn studied my face. She searched my expression for any trace of defiance or deception. Finding none, her posture relaxed. The sweet maternal mask slid back into place, sealing her victory. Of course, sweetheart, Evelyn cooped, offering a patronizing smile. We understand. Go home. Rest. Tomorrow, this ugly business will all be behind us. I stood up, leaving the forged will and the conservatorship on the glass table. I did not say goodbye to Richard. I walked out of the echoing foyer, climbed into my truck, and locked the doors. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, but the tremor was no longer born of fear. It was pure adrenaline. They had committed a felony by forging a legal document. Evelyn had laid out her extortion perfectly. Every piece of their criminal conspiracy was falling into place. I drove away from the gated neighborhood, my mind racing with the logistics of the sting operation Elias and I needed to plan. My gas tank was hovering near empty. the orange fuel light glowing on the dashboard. I pulled into a small, dusty gas station on the edge of the highway. The harsh morning sun baked the concrete as I stepped out of the truck. I unzipped my wallet, retrieved my debit card, and slid it into the card reader on the pump. The machine chirped. I stared at the small digital screen, waiting for the prompt to enter my PIN code. Instead, the screen flashed a bright solid red. The digital text blocked my transaction. Declined. Account frozen. I pulled the card out and wiped the magnetic strip against my jeans, assuming it was a reader error. I inserted it a second time. The machine chirped again. The same red text glared back at me. Declined. Please contact your financial institution. A cold knot tightened in my throat. I pulled out my phone and opened my mobile banking application. The loading wheel spun for 3 agonizing seconds before my checking and savings balances appeared on the screen. Both accounts displayed a balance of 0, accompanied by a stark yellow banner at the top of the interface. Administrative hold. Funds restricted. The illusion of having 24 hours to plan my next move shattered into dust. The extortion in the dining room had just been a distraction. My family had already triggered the execution. The blazing New Mexico sun suddenly felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I stared at the bright yellow banner on my phone screen. Administrative hold. Funds restricted. The words blurred together as my pulse hammered in my ears. I possessed nearly $12,000 across my checking and savings accounts. It was a modest sum carefully accumulated over 5 years of researching desert ecosystems. But it was my safety net. It was my rent, my groceries, and the legal retainer I desperately needed to hire an attorney to fight Evelyn's forged will. Now I was staring at a balance of 0. I leaned against the dusty side panel of my truck and dialed the customer service number listed on the back of my debit card. The automated voice system droned on for 4 agonizing minutes before connecting me to a live representative. "My name is relatable John," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I am trying to purchase gasoline, but my card is declining. The mobile app says there is an administrative hold on my accounts." The representative tapped at her keyboard. The rhythmic clicking echoed over the line. "Yes, Miss John. I see the hold here. It appears an emergency injunction was filed early this morning by a cosigner on your primary checking account." My stomach plummeted. A cosigner. When I was 18 years old, preparing to leave for university, my father had insisted on co-signing my first bank account. He claimed it was a necessary step to help me build a healthy credit score. He framed it as an act of paternal protection. I had never bothered to remove his name from the registry. Trusting the quiet distance between our lives was a sufficient boundary. "Who filed the injunction?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The account was restricted by Richard John," the representative stated flatly. "The injunction cites a medical emergency, specifically a claim of severe mental instability and risk of self-harm following a family tragedy. Under the state statutes for vulnerable adults, he requested an immediate freeze on all liquid assets to prevent erratic financial behavior. To lift this hold, you will need to provide documentation from a licensed psychiatrist clearing you of cognitive distress or a court order reversing the injunction." They had weaponized my grief. They had twisted my quiet demeanor into a fabricated narrative of a psychological breakdown. Richard did not just freeze my money. He used his connections and his polished executive authority to paint me as an unstable liability, locking me out of my own life. I disconnected the call without saying goodbye. The brutal elegance of their strategy was terrifying. If I went to the police right now and reported the forged will or the journal, Richard's lawyers would simply pull the bank records. They would point to the fraudulent mental instability injunction and claim I was a hysterical, grieving daughter experiencing paranoid delusions. They would discredit my testimony before I even stepped foot inside a courtroom. I climbed back into my truck, turning the key in the ignition. The engine coughed and sputtered, running on the last drags of fuel. I had just enough gas to make it back to Albuquerque proper. I drove to a rundown diner off Route 66. A dimly lit establishment favored by long-haul truckers and exhausted shift workers. The interior smelled of burnt coffee and frying grease. It was the perfect place to disappear. I found Elias and Harrison sitting in a cracked vinyl booth near the back emergency exit. I slid into the booth across from them. I set Sylvia's coated journal and the brass safe deposit key onto the sticky laminate table. They forged a superseding will, leaving everything to Julian. I said, keeping my voice low. And Richard just triggered a fraudulent injunction on my bank accounts. They froze every dollar I own. They are starving me out. Elias did not look surprised. He reached across the table and pulled the journal toward him, his rough fingers tracing the black leather cover. They are accelerating the timeline. Julian's creditors must be tightening the screws. Harrison pushed his reading glasses up the bridge of his nose. This complicates our legal strategy significantly. Relatable. A financial chokehold of this magnitude requires an immediate response. If we take this journal and the brass key to a judge today, we will spark a massive civil litigation battle. Why civil? I demanded. The journal proves Evelyn murdered my grandmother. It is homicide. It is circumstantial evidence of homicide. Harrison corrected gently. A defense attorney will argue Sylvia was an elderly woman suffering from dementia and the journal is a work of paranoid fiction. They will claim the lab results Alias obtained are flawed because the chain of custody for the blood samples was not supervised by law enforcement. They will drag this through the courts for 5 years and Richard will fund their defense by liquidating the estate. We cannot win a war of attrition. They have millions in credit. You have a frozen bank account. Then how do we stop them? I asked. The frustration finally cracking the edges of my quiet composure. They hold all the power. Elias leaned back against the vinyl booth. His dark eyes locked onto mine. They hold the power because you let them dictate the terms of engagement. They expect you to fight them with lawyers and outrage. They expect you to panic. He unzipped a small black duffel bag resting on the seat beside him. But you are a botanist, Elias said, his voice dropping to a growly whisper. You know how to observe a predator. You know how to wait for the exact moment they expose their throat. We do not need a civil trial. We need a criminal conviction so airtight that Richard's lawyers cannot spin a single syllable of doubt. We need them to commit an undeniable caught-on-tape felony. Alias reached into the duffel bag and pulled out a small circular device. It looked exactly like a standard white plastic smoke detector. This is a high-definition motion-activated surveillance camera. Alias explained. It records audio and streams directly to a secure server. I will mount it on the ceiling of your living room. The angle covers the entryway, the coffee table and the kitchen counter. A sting operation. I whispered, staring at the plastic device. Exactly. Harrison nodded. If you invite them over under the pretense of surrender, their arrogance will take over. They will bring the fraudulent conservatorship documents for you to sign. If they attempt to curse you, threaten you, or physically force your hand while the camera is rolling, we have them on extortion and elder abuse charges. That gives the police probable cause to seize their assets and investigate the murder journal properly. The psychological weight of the plan settled over me. I had to invite the monsters into my sanctuary. I had to sit in a room with the woman who poisoned my grandmother and the father who erased my financial existence. And I had to smile. I looked at the brass key resting on the diner table. I thought about the sentry plant in the greenhouse sacrificing itself to leave behind a protective shell. Sylvia had built this trap. I just needed to lure the predators inside and snap it shut. My silence was my greatest weakness in their eyes. I was the fragile, quiet daughter who never pushed back. It was time to use that perceived weakness as my ultimate weapon. "I am ready," I said. My voice was steady, stripped of any remaining fear. "What is the first step?" Elias pushed the burner phone across the table. "Call your mother," Elias instructed. "Cry. Beg. Tell them they won and invite them over to sign the papers." I stared at the black screen of the burner phone resting on the diner table. The plastic casing felt cheap and hollow under my fingertips. I needed to summon a level of vulnerability I had spent my entire adult life trying to bury. I closed my eyes and drew a shallow, uneven breath, allowing the raw exhaustion of the past 3 days to flood my vocal cords. I pressed the call button and held the device to my ear. The line rang twice before Evelyn answered. "Hello," my mother said. Her tone was brisk and guarded. "Mom," I whispered. I let my voice crack on the single syllable. There was a brief pause. The ambient noise of a television playing softly in the background cut out, indicating she had muted the screen to grant me her full predatory attention. "Mabel," she replied, her voice dipping into that sickening pool of counterfeit maternal concern. "Are you all right? You left the house in such a rush this morning." "I cannot buy gas," I sobbed. I pushed a physical tremor into my throat, letting a genuine tear of frustration spill over my eyelashes to anchor the performance. My card declined at the pump. The bank told me my accounts are frozen. I have nothing. I cannot even buy groceries. "Please, Mom. You have to tell Dad to stop. I cannot fight you anymore." The silence stretching across the cellular connection felt heavy with Evelyn's triumphant satisfaction. She had applied the pressure, and her fragile daughter had snapped exactly on schedule. "Oh, sweetheart," Evelyn cooped. Her condescension was a physical weight pressing against my eardrum. "We did not want to take such drastic measures. But you were acting so erratically. Your father was terrified you might hurt yourself or drain your savings in a grief-induced panic. We only restricted the funds to protect you." "I will sign the conservatorship," I pleaded, squeezing my eyes shut to maintain the wavering pitch of my voice. "I will sign whatever you want. Just give me the $50,000 and unfreeze my checking account. I surrender." A soft, contented sigh whispered through the speaker. "That is a very mature decision. Mabel. We are so proud of you for seeing reason. Go home and rest. Your father, your brother, and I will come to your apartment at 7 o'clock tonight. We will bring the paperwork and a cashier's check." "Thank you," I whimpered before ending the call. I lowered the phone and looked across the sticky laminate table at Elias and Harrison. My tears evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. "They took the bait," I said. The afternoon hours dissolved into a blur of calculated preparation. Elias followed me back to my apartment complex. He carried a nondescript metal toolbox, blending in seamlessly as a standard maintenance worker. Inside my living room, he worked with quiet surgical efficiency. He removed the old smoke detector from the center of the ceiling and wired the new high-definition surveillance device in its place. The tiny undetectable lens offered a panoramic view of the entryway. The beige sofa, the wooden coffee table, and the open archway leading directly into the kitchen. He handed me a sleek black smartwatch and synced the digital interface to the hidden camera feed. "I will be parked in the gray utility van across the street," Elias explained, packing his tools away. "The audio and video feeds are streaming directly to a secure cloud server, and I am recording a local backup on my encrypted laptop. If they lay a hand on you, or if they confess to the financial extortion on tape, I will contact the local precinct immediately. Just keep them talking. Let their arrogance do the heavy lifting." He left through the back stairwell. The subsequent silence in my apartment was deafening. The psychological claustrophobia returned. But this time I was not the prey waiting to be hunted in the dark. I was the spider sitting quietly at the center of the web. I staged the room to reflect my supposed defeat. I placed a box of tissues on the coffee table. I drew the blinds shut to create a gloomy, depressive atmosphere. I arranged my posture on the sofa to look small and broken. The digital clock on the microwave shifted to 7. The sharp chime of the doorbell shattered the quiet. My pulse spiked, hammering a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. I walked to the front door and peered through the brass peephole. The distorted fisheye lens revealed the 3 predators standing in my dimly lit hallway. Richard stood at the front, his broad shoulders squared, radiating executive dominance. Evelyn stood beside him, clutching her designer leather handbag like a trophy. Julianne lingered a half step behind them, shifting his weight from foot to foot with nervous, erratic energy. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door inward. Evelyn stepped over the threshold first. She bypassed any formal greeting, wrapping her arms around my shoulders in a suffocating embrace. I forced myself to endure the scent of her citrus and cedar perfume without flinching. "My poor girl," Evelyn murmured, patting my back with feigned affection. "You look exhausted. This ordeal has taken such a toll on your fragile nerves." I stepped back, keeping my head bowed to hide my eyes. "Come in," I said softly. Richard marched into the center of the living room. He did not bother to survey his surroundings. He viewed my modest apartment with undisguised contempt. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and tossed a thick blue folder onto the wooden coffee table. The heavy stack of paper slapped against the wood with a sharp authoritative crack. "Let us skip the pleasantries," Richard sneered. He pointed a thick finger at the documents. "Sit down. Be a good girl. And sign the papers. Murable. We have wasted enough time humoring this little rebellion of yours." Evelyn placed a gentle, restraining hand on his forearm. "Richard, please," she chided softly. Her tone was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She played the gentle peacemaker, elevating her own status by contrasting herself against his blunt aggression. "Do not bark at her. She is ready to cooperate." Julian bypassed the sofa entirely. He paced toward the window overlooking the street, peering through the linen blinds. His jaw was clenched tight. The dark shadows under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. He needed this transaction finalized tonight, or his creditors would come collecting blood. I sank onto the edge of the sofa cushion, staring blankly at the blue folder. The snare was primed. I just needed to separate myself from them to let their true colors bleed onto the digital recording. "I will sign," I whispered, reaching for a tissue and dabbing at my dry eyes. "But my hands are shaking too much to hold a pen right now. Let me make us a pot of coffee. We should sit together for a moment. Let us celebrate family peace." Richard rolled his eyes, emitting a harsh scoff of disapproval. But Evelyn nodded gracefully, taking a seat on the armchair opposite the sofa. "That sounds lovely, darling," Evelyn said. "We are in no rush now." I stood up and retreated through the open archway into the small kitchen. The tiled floor offered a visual barrier, separating me from the living room, though I could still hear the rustle of their clothing. I turned my back to them, reaching for the bag of ground coffee beans and the glass calf. I tapped the face of the black smartwatch secured around my left wrist. The dark screen flickered to life, displaying the crystal-clearer high-definition feed from the ceiling camera. The dramatic irony was intoxicating. I watched my family through the digital lens, knowing Elias and his secure servers were capturing every single pixel. On the screen, Richard unbuttoned his cuffs and smirked at his wife. "You see," he muttered, his voice carrying perfectly through the hidden microphone. "You just have to apply the right amount of leverage. Squeeze the bank accounts and she folds like wet paper." Evelyn smiled. It was a cold, triumphant expression that chilled my blood. "She is weak, Richard. She always has been." It was absurd to think she could outmaneuver us. I watched the feed with grim satisfaction. They were confessing to the financial extortion out loud. They were handing Illers the exact leverage Harrison needed to destroy their credibility in a court of law. But the scene playing out on my wrist was not over. Julian stepped away from the window. He moved with a sudden, rigid purpose. He did not walk toward the coffee table to inspect the documents. He walked toward the open archway leading into my kitchen. He stopped just outside my peripheral vision, lingering near the edge of the granite counter where my personal items rested. I kept my back turned, pretending to measure coffee grounds into the paper filter, while my eyes remained glued to the tiny digital screen on my wrist. Julian reached deep into the pocket of his tailored slacks. His fingers withdrew a small transparent glass vial filled with a clear liquid. My heart stopped beating. He was not looking at the coffee tray I was preparing for the group. He was staring directly at the tall glass water pitcher sitting on the edge of the counter. It was the personal pitcher I kept filled with ice and lemon slices for myself. He uncapped the vial, his thumb hovering over the rim. His eyes darted toward the back of my head, calculating the distance. He was preparing to strike. The liquid from Julian's vial fell in 3 distinct drops. They hit the surface of the ice water without a sound, dissolving instantly into the transparent depth of the pitcher. He capped the small glass tube and slid it back into his tailored slacks. He retreated to his previous position by the window before I even drew my next breath. I lowered my wrist, letting the sleeve of my sweater cover the dark screen of the smartwatch. My hands grasped the edge of the granite counter. The cold stone anchored me to reality. The strategy clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Julian was not using the slow-acting neurotoxin Evelyn had fed to Sylvia. That particular poison required weeks of steady administration to mimic a natural cardiac decline. They did not have weeks. They needed my signature on the conservatorship tonight. The substance inside that glass vial was a heavy, fast-acting sedative. It was likely a veterinary tranquilizer or a potent date-rape narcotic sourced from the dark web. Their plan was brutally efficient. If I consumed that water, my motor skills would deteriorate within minutes. My vision would blur and my muscles would turn to lead. Once I was incapacitated, Richard would simply wrap his large hand over mine, force the silver pen across the signature line of the legal document, and secure control of the estate. But the cruelty extended far beyond a forged signature. Richard had already laid the necessary groundwork with the bank injunction early this morning. He had filed formal claims of my severe mental instability. Once I collapsed on the sofa, they would not just walk away. They would dial for emergency services. They would tell the arriving paramedics that I had suffered a hysterical, grief-induced, psychotic break. I would wake up locked inside a psychiatric ward, chemically restrained and legally stripped of my autonomy, while my family liquidated my grandmother's legacy. I was not just fighting for my inheritance. I was fighting for my freedom. The coffee machine emitted a sharp, high-pitched beep, signaling the end of the brewing cycle. The rich, dark scent of roasted beans filled the small kitchen, masking the invisible chemical threat lurking inside the water pitcher. I arranged 3 ceramic mugs on a silver serving tray. I added a small ceramic pitcher of cream and a bowl of sugar cubes. I placed my personal water glass on the corner of the tray directly next to the tainted pitcher. I picked up the heavy silver tray. The metal handles dug into my palms. I stepped out from beneath the archway and walked back into the living room. The atmosphere in the room felt thick and suffocating, like the heavy air preceding a desert flash flood. Richard sat on the edge of the sofa, his expensive leather shoes tapping an impatient rhythm against the hardwood floor. Evelyn reclined gracefully in the armchair, her legs crossed at the ankle. Julian stood near the drawn blinds, his shoulders tight, his gaze locked onto the tray in my hands. I forced my facial muscles to remain slack and defeated. I set the heavy tray down onto the wooden coffee table, pushing the blue conservatorship folder a few inches to the side to make room. I poured the dark coffee into the first mug and handed it to my father. He took it without offering a word of gratitude. Taking a quick testing sip before setting it down, I prepared the second mug, adding a single splash of cream, and offered it to my mother. Evelyn accepted the warm ceramic with a soft, radiant smile. "Thank you, sweetheart," she purred. "This is exactly what we needed. A moment to sit down as a family and breathe. We have all been under such a terrible strain." Julian declined the coffee with a quick shake of his head. He stepped away from the window and moved closer to the center of the room. "I am fine," he muttered. "Let us just get this paperwork sorted out." I nodded, maintaining the illusion of compliance. I reached for the tall glass pitcher. The ice cubes clinked against the crystal sides as I tilted the spout, pouring the tainted water into my own glass. The glass of ice water felt heavy in my palm. Condensation beaded against the smooth surface, dripping a single cold line down my wrist. Across the narrow coffee table, my mother offered a thin painted smile. Her eyes did not match the warmth of her mouth. Beside her, my brother leaned forward. His gaze was fixed on the rim of my glass, tracking every inch it moved toward my lips. I knew what was in the water. I knew Julian had poured it. I also knew the hidden camera in the smoke detector above our heads was capturing every breath they took, streaming the footage directly to Elias Thorne and his secure servers. "Drink up, darling," Evelyn urged, gesturing toward my hand with her manicured fingers. "You look so parched. Dehydration only makes the grief worse. You need to take better care of yourself." I lowered the glass, resting it against my knee. I reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan sweater. My fingers brushed against the dry, rough texture of the wild desert sage I had carried away from Sylvia's graveside. The small sprig smelled of bitter earth and rain. A botanist learned survival through chemistry. The desert sage Artemisia tridentata flourishes in soil saturated with harsh, unforgiving alkalis. To survive in that toxic environment, the plant produces a highly specific enzyme within its cellular structure. This enzyme acts as a biological shield. When the crushed leaves of the desert sage are exposed to high concentrations of foreign synthetic alkaloids, the cellular walls break down and trigger an immediate chemical reaction. It acts as a flawless natural litmus test. I pulled the sprig of sage from my pocket. "What is that?" Richard asked, frowning at the dead plant material in my hand. "Just a piece of Grandma's garden," I whispered, keeping my eyes cast downward. "A little piece of her memory." I pinched the dry leaves between my thumb and forefinger, crushing the cell walls to release the dormant enzymes. I held my hand over the rim of the glass and dropped the crushed sage directly into the ice water. The reaction was instantaneous. The moment the botanical enzymes made contact with the heavy sedative Julian had poured into the pitcher, the chemical structure of the water collapsed. A vibrant blooming cloud of pigment erupted from the floating leaves. The color expanded rapidly, swirling through the ice cubes like a drop of toxic dye. Within 3 seconds, the crystal-clear water shifted into a sickly glowing neon yellow. The visual shock was staggering. The tainted liquid radiated an unnatural fluorescent hue against the dim lighting of the living room. The silence that fell over the apartment was absolute. Julian stumbled a half-step backward, his expensive shoes scraping against the floorboards. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale ashen gray. His eyes widened in raw panic as he stared at the glowing yellow liquid. Evelyn froze. The warm cup of coffee hovered inches from her mouth. Her painted smile fractured, slipping down into a hard, rigid line of confusion. She looked from the neon glass to my face, her calculating mind struggling to process the failure of their trap. Richard frowned, leaning forward to inspect the glass. "What the hell is wrong with your water?" he demanded, his voice thick with irritation. I lifted my head. I did not look at the water. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. The fragile, broken posture I had worn for 3 days dissolved. The manufactured tremor in my throat vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened steel. I set the yellow glass down onto the wooden coffee table. The heavy crystal base struck the wood with a sharp echoing clack. The quiet facade shattered. "I am not drinking it," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady through the silent room. "And I am not signing." Richard stood up. The leather of the sofa groaned under his shifting weight. He was a large man, accustomed to using his physical stature to end boardroom disputes and intimidate his opposition. He stepped around the wooden coffee table, casting a dark shadow over my seated form. He expected me to cower. He anticipated the fragile daughter would shrink away from his towering anger and submit to his demands. But the fear that had governed my entire life was gone. It had burned away the moment the water turned neon yellow. I did not move a single inch. I tilted my head upward, meeting his furious stare with an icy, unbroken gaze. "Stop playing these pathetic games," Richard ordered. His voice was a low, threatening rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Sign the paper right now, or I swear I will have you committed to a psychiatric ward before the sun comes up." I reached under the wooden coffee table. My fingers found the cold aluminum chassis of my hidden laptop. I pulled the device onto my lap and lifted the screen. The display illuminated the dim living room with a harsh bluish glow. I turned the keyboard toward my father. "Take a look," I said softly. Richard frowned, his brow furrowing as he looked down at the bright screen. Evelyn shifted in her armchair, craning her neck to see the digital image. Julian remained frozen near the window, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The monitor displayed a paused frame from the hidden camera mounted on the ceiling. The high-definition image was crisp and undeniable. It showed Julian standing in the kitchen archway. His hand was caught in midair holding the small glass vial directly over my personal water pitcher. The liquid was captured mid-drop, falling toward the ice. The room imploded into a suffocating, terrified silence. Julian let out a strangled gasp. He took another step backward, his shoulder slamming hard against the window frame. He shook his head, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for the invisible lens that had captured his felony. "That is a lie," Julian stammered, his voice cracking into a high pitch of raw panic. "I was just putting flavor drops in the water. I swear it was just a dietary supplement." I pressed a button on the keyboard, letting the video play. The audio captured his quiet footsteps, the uncapping of the vial, and the soft clink of the glass. I pressed pause again, freezing the digital evidence on the screen. "Flavor drops do not turn desert sage neon yellow," I replied. "You tried to drug me. You brought a chemical restraint into my home to force my signature. That is aggravated assault and attempted extortion. And the footage is already sitting on a secure server, hundreds of miles away from here." Richard stared at the laptop. His jaw slacked. The executive dominance he had wielded just moments before evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aging man. He looked at his son, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. But the trap was only half sprung. I reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the black leather journal. I set the book onto the coffee table right on top of the blue conservatorship folder. Evelyn's gaze snapped to the dark leather cover. Her pristine composure began to crack. The muscles in her neck pulled tight and her manicured fingers gripped the armrests of her chair until her knuckles turned white. "Sylvia knew you were bleeding her dry," I stated, keeping my tone measured and clinical. She knew Julian was facing federal indictment for investor fraud. She knew about the desperate loans and the server farms. And she knew exactly how you planned to fix the problem. I flipped the journal open to a marked page. I did not look at my brother or my father. I looked straight into the eyes of the true architect. Sunday, the 4th of the month. I read aloud, my voice cutting through the stagnant air. Evelyn brought chamomile tea. She poured 3 milligrams of the synthetic compound into the thermos before she arrived. My hands shook for 2 days. Sunday the 11th. Lemon cake. 4 milligrams. The metallic taste lingered on my tongue until Tuesday. My heart rate dropped to 40 beats per minute. I turned the page. The crisp paper rustling in the quiet apartment. Sunday the 18th. I continued. She increased the dosage to 6 milligrams. She sat across from me and held my hand while my chest tightened. She smiled the entire time. She is methodical. She is a parasite. I closed the journal. The heavy thud of the cover echoed like a gavel striking wood. You murdered her, I said. You slowly poisoned your own mother-in-law to steal an aquifer. And you let Richard believe he was the one running the show. The illusion of family loyalty disintegrated. Richard spun around to face his wife. The color had drained from his face, replaced by a sickly mottled gray. What is she talking about? Richard demanded, his voice trembling with a sudden, desperate fear. Evelyn, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not do this. Julian slid down the wall, his knees buckling until he hit the floor. He buried his face in his hands, releasing a pathetic, muffled sob. We are going to prison. He wept. We are going to prison. Evelyn did not answer her husband. She did not comfort her weeping son. She sat in the armchair. Her eyes locked onto the black journal. A strange, terrifying transformation overtook her features. The soft maternal mask melted away entirely. Her face hardened into a portrait of pure, unadulterated venom. The sweet melodic tone she used to manipulate the world vanished, replaced by a harsh, grating snarl. She deserved it. Evelyn hissed. The words hung in the air, dripping with malice. Richard took a step back, horrified by the monster sitting in his living room. Evelyn stood up. She smoothed her tailored blazer, her chest heaving with explosive rage. She hoarded that wealth while we drowned. Evelyn screamed, her voice echoing off the thin walls of the apartment. We were facing bankruptcy. We were going to lose the house, the cars, the reputation we spent decades building. She had millions of gallons of water sitting useless beneath the dirt, and she refused to save her own blood. She was a selfish, stubborn old relic. Evelyn turned her vicious glare toward Richard. And you, she spat, her lip curling with profound disgust. You are a weak, incompetent coward. You could not convince her to sign the deeds. You could not manage the debt. I had to step in and secure our future because you are too pathetic to do what is necessary. She pointed a trembling finger at Julian, who was curled into a tight ball on the floor. And your brilliant son needed a bailout to keep the federal agents away. I did what a mother does. I fixed the problem. I removed the obstacle. The family dynamic shattered into a million jagged pieces. They were no longer a unified front of wealth and privilege. They were three-cornered animals turning their teeth on each other to survive. Richard stared at his wife, paralyzed by the realization that he was married to a calculating killer. Julian wept into his hands, mourning his own ruined life. But Evelyn was not finished. Her raging eyes snapped back to me. The hatred radiating from her gaze was a physical force. You little rat. Evelyn snarled. You sat in the corner your entire life pretending to be invisible. You think you can destroy us? You think a journal and a cheap camera will save you? She did not hesitate. The instinct for self-preservation overrode whatever shred of rationality remained in her mind. Evelyn lunged across the glass coffee table, her arms extended, her manicured fingers curled into rigid claws. aiming directly for my throat. She was a cornered predator, desperate to silence the only witness to her crimes, willing to destroy her own daughter to protect her lavish, stolen lifestyle. I braced myself, raising my arms to block her attack. But before her grasping hands could make contact with my skin, a deafening concussive boom rocked the apartment. The wooden front door burst inward. The heavy deadbolt ripped through the door frame, sending splintered wood flying across the entryway. Albuquerque police. A booming voice roared over the chaos. Nobody move. The heavy wooden door splintered inward. The reinforced frame tore away from the drywall and a shower of jagged pine and twisted metal. 5 uniformed police officers poured into the narrow entryway. Black tactical gear, drawn weapons, and the blinding glare of high-lumen flashlights transformed my quiet living room into a chaotic staging area. Evelyn was caught in mid-air. Her feral lunge toward my throat was intercepted by the sheer physical shock of the breach. She stumbled sideways, her expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished hardwood floor. She crashed hard into the edge of the sofa, gasping for breath as a beam of bright white light hit her directly in the face. "Get down on the ground," the lead officer shouted. His voice was a booming baritone that rattled the framed photographs hanging on my walls. "Show me your hands right now." The illusion of their untouchable wealth evaporated in a fraction of a second. Richard did not attempt to protect his wife. The towering, intimidating executive who had threatened to destroy my life just moments ago collapsed like a punctured lung. He dropped straight to his knees, throwing his hands high into the air. His broad shoulders trembled. He squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face away from the blinding flashlights. He offered zero resistance. He did not ask for a lawyer. He just surrendered to the physical authority of the officers, allowing a patrolman to wrench his arms behind his back. The metallic ratcheting of the steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the room. Julian scrambled backward like a frightened animal. He hit the wall near the window, his tailored slacks dragging against the baseboards. He raised his arms, shielding his face, sobbing openly. Elias Thorne stepped through the ruined doorway, walking calmly behind the wall of armed officers. He did not carry a weapon. He wore a pair of blue nitrile forensic gloves. The private investigator moved through the frantic scene with cold surgical precision. He bypassed the screaming suspects and walked straight to the wooden coffee table. He pulled a thick plastic evidence bag from his jacket. With steady hands, Elias lifted the glass of glowing neon yellow water. He sealed the crystal tumbler inside the plastic, locking away the chemical proof of their extortion. Elias then turned his attention to my brother. Julian was curled against the wall, weeping hysterically as an officer hauled him up by the collar of his dress shirt. Elias approached him, reaching directly into the front pocket of Julian's slacks. He extracted the small transparent glass vial. The remaining drops of the heavy sedative sloshed against the glass. Elias dropped the vial into a second evidence bag, sealing it tight. "No," Julian wailed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched shriek. "Please. You do not understand. It is a misunderstanding. Relatable. Tell them." My brother looked at me. The arrogant golden child of the family was gone. His expensive haircut was ruined, plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. His face was stained with tears. He strained against the grip of the arresting officer, fighting to make eye contact with me. "Mabel, please," Julian begged, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "We are blood. We grew up together. I did not want to hurt you. Mom made me do it. She said we would lose everything. Tell them it was just a joke. Tell them we were just trying to calm your nerves." I stood perfectly still near the edge of the kitchen archway. I looked at the boy I had known my entire life. I searched my chest for any remaining shred of sisterly affection, any lingering instinct to protect him. I found nothing. You poured the glass. Julian, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried across the room with lethal clarity. You made your choice. His face crumpled. He dropped his head, his sobs devolving into wet, ragged gasps as the officer dragged him toward the hallway. Evelyn did not go quietly. My mother refused to surrender her dignity, which only made her physical removal more humiliating. As an officer grabbed her elbow to guide her toward the floor, she lashed out. She swung her manicured hand, her fingernails catching the fabric of the patrolman's uniform. Do not touch me, Evelyn shrieked. Her voice was shrill and raw. Do you know who I am? You are making a terrible mistake. I will sue this entire department. I will have your badges. The officers did not care about her zip code or her country club memberships. 2 patrolmen grabbed her arms, forcing her down onto the hardwood floor. Her tailored charcoal blazer bunched around her shoulders. Her perfect salon-styled hair fell across her face in messy tangled strands. The pristine, sophisticated matriarch was entirely erased. She thrashed against the floorboards, kicking her expensive heels, spitting venom and obscenities at the men restraining her. She turned her head, fixing her wild, hateful eyes on me as the steel cuffs locked around her wrists. You are nothing. Evelyn screamed at me. You are a weak, pathetic little weed. You will lose that estate. You will never survive without us. I did not blink. I watched the officers pull her up by her arms. She stumbled, her posture hunched and feral. Goodbye, Mom, I whispered. The police hauled them out of my apartment one by one. The heavy boots marched down the exterior stairwell, carrying the broken pieces of my family out into the cold desert night. I walked slowly to the window and pushed the linen blinds aside. The street below was bathed in the rhythmic, strobing glare of red and blue emergency lights. 3 marked cruisers and Elias Thorne's unmarked utility van blocked the intersection. I watched Richard, Evelyn, and Julian get shoved into the back of separate patrol cars. Their silhouettes disappeared behind the dark-tinted glass. I let the blinds fall back into place. The apartment was suddenly quiet. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy and hollow. There was no soaring rush of victory. There was no triumphant joy in watching my parents and my brother get hauled away in handcuffs. I felt a profound aching emptiness settling deep into my bones. I walked over to the armchair where Evelyn had been sitting just minutes ago. The cushion still held the faint indentation of her weight. The faint scent of citrus and cedar lingered in the stagnant air. Sylvia had warned me long ago. I remembered sitting in the greenhouse watching her slice the dark rod away from the healthy cactus tissue. I understood now what she meant. Money does not change a person's character. It does not create greed out of thin air. Wealth acts as a chemical solvent. It strips away the polite social conditioning. It dissolves the fake smiles and the forced family dinners. It just removes the mask faster, exposing the raw, hungry predators hiding underneath. My family had always been monsters. The impending loss of their lavish lifestyle simply forced them to stop hiding it. A soft footstep sounded near the ruined entryway. I turned around. Harrison Reed stepped over the splintered debris of my front door. The elderly lawyer wore a long wool trench coat, his silver hair neatly combed. Despite the late hour, he surveyed the destroyed living room, his intelligent eyes taking in the overturned coffee mugs, the discarded evidence bags, and the stark reality of the sting operation. He walked over to the wooden coffee table. He looked down at the blue folder containing the temporary conservatorship documents. The signature line at the bottom of the page remained blank. Harrison reached out and closed the folder, covering the predatory legal trap forever. He looked up at me, offering a solemn, respectful nod. The attempted drugging and conspiracy charges will put them away for decades, Harrison said. His voice was a calm, Steady anchor in the aftermath of the storm. The police have the vial, the yellow water, the journal, and the video footage. Their heartbreak defense attorneys will not be able to spin a single detail. The criminal threat is neutralized. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension drain out of my muscles. It is over. Harrison shook his head slowly. The corners of his mouth turned upward in a faint knowing smile. The survival part is over. Relatable. He corrected gently. But tomorrow. Bring the brass key. It is time to finish your grandmother's work. The morning sun broke over the jagged peaks of the Sandia Mountains, flooding the Albuquerque basin with a pale golden light. I drove downtown in a state of profound lingering shock. The radio in my truck remained off. The quiet interior of the cab offered a stark contrast to the explosive chaos that had torn my living room apart hours earlier. My hands gripped the steering wheel, steady and resolute. The fear that had dictated my posture for 34 years was gone, replaced by a cold clinical focus. I parked outside the First National Depository. The building was a fortress of pale granite and reinforced glass designed to project unshakable permanence. The heavy doors glided open, ushering me into a sprawling, temperature-controlled lobby. The air inside smelled of polished marble and ozone. It was an environment built to protect secrets. Harrison Reed stood near the central reception desk. He wore a crisp charcoal suit, clutching a sleek black leather briefcase. He greeted me with a solemn nod, turning immediately to speak with the branch manager. No pleasantries were exchanged. We were operating on a strict, irreversible timeline. The manager, a stern woman in a dark navy dress, led us away from the public telestations. We walked down a long, quiet corridor lined with abstract corporate art. At the end of the hall stood a massive circular steel vault door. The metallic locking bolts were thicker than my forearms. We stepped through the imposing archway and entered the subterranean safe deposit room. The silence inside the vault was absolute. The thick concrete walls absorbed every echo, creating a sterile, isolated vacuum. Row upon row of brushed steel compartments lined the perimeter, stretching from the floor to the high ceiling. The manager guided us to a private soundproof viewing room adjacent to the main vault. The space was austere, furnished only with a heavy mahogany table and 3 leather chairs. She gestured toward a rectangular steel box resting in the center of the table. "I will leave you to your business," the manager said softly. She stepped out of the room, pulling the thick acoustic door shut until the heavy latch engaged. I stood alone with Harrison. I reached into the zippered pocket of my purse and retrieved the solid brass key I had unearthed from the dying agave plant. The metal felt heavy and warm against my palm. I stepped forward and slid the key into the primary cylinder of the steel box. The tumblers aligned with a satisfying mechanical thud. I lifted the hinged lid and pushed it backward. Inside the velvet-lined container sat a staggering stack of legal parchment. The documents were bound tight with thick black ribbons. Resting directly on top of the towering pile of paper was a small silver USB flash drive. I looked at Harrison. He unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a slim silver laptop, setting it on the mahogany table. He did not ask me to hand over the drive yet. Instead, he reached into the steel box and carefully lifted the heavy bundle of documents. "Your parents thought they were playing a grand game of chess," Harrison began, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile room. "They believed they could forge a new will, freeze your personal bank accounts, and terrorize you into surrendering the estate. They operated under the assumption that Sylvia owned millions of dollars in property and liquid capital when she died." Harrison set the fixed stack of paper down. He rested his weathered hand flat against the top page. "But your grandmother was brilliant," he continued. "She understood the psychology of a parasite. She knew Evelyn and Richard would contest any standard will she filed. She knew Julian would deploy his corporate lawyers to drain the estate through endless probate hearings. So Sylvia executed a maneuver that rendered their entire strategy obsolete. I stared at the dense legal text peeking out from beneath the black ribbons. What did she do? I asked. Harrison adjusted his glasses. 8 months ago. Shortly after she first suspected Evelyn was tampering with her food. Sylvia hired a specialized team of financial architects. Together, we drafted these documents. We created an irrevocable blind trust. He tapped the thick parchment to emphasize his point. The word irrevocable is the anchor. Once a trust of this nature is signed and funded, it cannot be altered, cancelled, or contested by anyone, not even the person who created it. Months before the poison finally stopped her heart, Sylvia transferred her entire liquid fortune, the deed to the adobe house, and every single subterranean water right into this trust. The sheer magnitude of the legal trap crystallized in my mind. That means Sylvia owned nothing when she died. I whispered. Exactly. Harrison confirmed. A fierce spark of triumph flashing in his eyes. Her net worth on the day she passed away was 0. The estate bypassed the probate court entirely. A judge will never review it. And creditors can never touch it. The superseding will your mother forged last night is a worthless piece of scrap paper. They committed a felony to steal an empire that did not exist. Evelyn, Richard, and Julian fought a brutal, desperate war over an empty kingdom. A wave of profound awe washed over me. Sylvia had not just protected her legacy. She had orchestrated a flawless, untouchable sanctuary. While my family scrambled to forge signatures and mix chemicals, my grandmother had quietly and legally erased the prize they were hunting. But a trust requires an administrator, I noted, looking at the silver flash drive. It requires a sole executive. Harrison corrected. And the trust was written with a very specific activation clause. It remained dormant until the appointed executive arrived in this exact room with that brass key. Harrison opened the lid of the silver laptop. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dim viewing room. He gestured toward the small USB drive resting in the velvet box. I picked up the silver rectangle. My fingers trembled slightly. I plugged the device into the side port of the computer. A digital folder immediately popped onto the screen. Inside the folder was a single audio file. I reached for the trackpad, moving the cursor over the play button. I took a slow, deep breath, bracing myself for the emotional impact of hearing her voice again. I clicked the mouse. A soft hiss of static crackled from the laptop speakers. It was followed by the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock that stood in Sylvia's hallway. Then she spoke. "Mabel. My sweet girl." Sylvia's voice echoed through the soundproof room. The sound of her tone hit my chest like a physical blow. Her voice was noticeably weaker than I remembered. It lacked the robust, vibrant energy she used to command the greenhouse. A wet laboured wheeze interrupted her breathing, documenting the devastating toll the synthetic neurotoxins had taken on her lungs and her heart. But beneath the physical frailty, her mind remained razor-sharp. The cadence of her words held an unbreakable steely resolve. "If you are sitting in this vault listening to my voice," the recording continued, "it means my body finally gave out. It means I did not finish the paperwork in time and I had to leave the final steps to you. It also means you found the journal. You found the key and you saw through the people who share our blood." I closed my eyes, letting a single tear slide down my cheek. I pictured her sitting at her heavy oak desk, speaking into a microphone while the poison circulated through her veins. "You were always so quiet, Mabel," Sylvia said, a faint trace of a smile warming the audio track. "They looked at your silence and saw a victim. They thought you were too fragile to fight back. But I knew the truth. I taught you how to graft the cacti. I taught you how to survive the desert. I knew your silence was just you studying the predators. The recording paused as Sylvia took a long, painful breath. The static hummed in the background. I knew they were poisoning me. Relatable. Sylvia's recording stated. The raw truth of her words chilled the air in the sterile vault. I let them do it so I could build this trap. But to snap it shut, I need you to do one last thing. The faint static from the laptop speakers hissed through the soundproof viewing room. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the silver screen. Sylvia drew another labored breath, the terrible sound rattling deep within her failing lungs. It was the visceral audio of a woman enduring her own execution to secure the future of her bloodline. I did not build this trust simply to shield the land. Relatable. My grandmother's voice continued. Her tone grew sharp, stripping away any lingering warmth to reveal a core of hardened steel. Protection is only half of the equation. A thick wall keeps the predators out, but it does not stop them from hunting. To truly end this, you must dismantle the ground they stand on. Harrison Reed sat across from me, his hands folded neatly over his leather briefcase. He watched my face, measuring my reaction as the true scope of the legal trap unfolded. Your parents believe they are untouchable, Sylvia stated. They parade through their gated communities and host their lavish dinners, projecting an illusion of flawless prosperity. Your brother builds his corporate empire on magazine covers and empty promises. But they built their lives on a foundation of borrowed paper. They financed their arrogance with toxic leverage. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold mahogany table. The pieces of Elias Thorne's investigation began to merge with my grandmother's final message. In our society, debt is a living thing, Sylvia explained, her voice carrying the dry clinical precision of a seasoned predator. It breeds. It trades hands. It can be bought. And it can be weaponized. The financial architects who drafted this trust did not just secure the subterranean aquifer and the Adobe estate. They protected a liquid capital reserve of $75 million. My breath caught in my throat. The sheer magnitude of the number echoed in the sterile vault. I had spent my life budgeting modest research grants and counting grocery receipts, entirely unaware of the staggering wealth hidden beneath Sylvia's quiet botanical lifestyle. That capital is your sword. Relatable. Sylvia urged, the intensity in her voice rising above the physical pain in her chest. I mapped the exact geometry of their ruin. I instructed Harrison to identify the private lenders underwriting Julian's failing server farms. I tracked down the specific holding companies that own the 3 separate mortgages on your parents' Mediterranean mansion. Those creditors are nervous. They know Julian is facing federal scrutiny. They know Richard is missing payments. They are eager to offload that toxic debt at a steep discount to anyone willing to assume the risk. The strategy was breathtaking in its elegance. It was a flawless execution of poetic justice. Sylvia was not just cutting them out of the will. She was handing me the financial guillotine. Use the trust, my grandmother commanded, her voice dropping to a fierce, unrelenting whisper. Do not just walk away from them. Buy the promissory notes. Purchase the corporate loans. Acquire the mortgages. You become the bank. You become the sole secured creditor. When the dust settles from their criminal trials, they will look for a way to rebuild. They will try to salvage their precious status. I want you to be the one holding the foreclosure notices. I want you to own their failures. A long stretch of silence followed her final instruction. The recording ended with the soft click of a tape recorder shutting off. The digital media player on the laptop screen faded to black. The heavy insulated quiet of the bank vault rushed back in, filling the space between Harrison and me. I sat back in my leather chair. My mind processed the brilliant, terrifying architecture of the snare. Evelyn had spent months slipping synthetic neurotoxins into my grandmother's tea, believing she was orchestrating a seamless transfer of power. She thought she was the apex predator. She never realized she was walking blindfolded into a financial slaughterhouse. Harrison reached out and closed the silver laptop. He pushed the device to the side of the table and pulled the thick stack of parchment toward the center. He untied the thick black ribbons binding the documents. "Your grandmother was a remarkable strategist," Harrison said softly. He spread the legal contracts across the polished wood. She understood that a prison sentence would only punish them for the crime. She wanted to punish them for their greed. She wanted to ensure that when they finally walk out of a cell, they have zero resources to harm you ever again. He tapped the top page of the stack. "This is the executive agreement for the irrevocable blind trust. The secondary contracts attached beneath it are the acquisition drafts. I have shell companies prepared and waiting to wire the funds. The private lenders holding Julian's tech loans are ready to sign the portfolios over today. The bank holding your parents' residential mortgage is prepared to transfer the deed of trust to our corporate entity by tomorrow morning." I looked down at the dense paragraphs of legal text. The words blurred into a beautiful lethal weapon. "If I sign this," I whispered, tracing the edge of the paper with my index finger, "I own the debt." Harrison nodded slowly. "You become the house. Relatable. You will possess the legal authority to liquidate Julian's corporate assets. You will hold the exclusive right to evict Evelyn and Richard from their gated community. You will own the locks on their doors. You will dictate the terms of their ruin." I closed my eyes. The memories of the past 3 days cascaded through my mind in a rapid, vivid sequence. I saw Richard looming over me in my living room, threatening to lock me inside a psychiatric ward to steal my autonomy. I saw Julian uncapping the glass vial, ready to drug my water pitcher and erase my future to save his own skin. I saw Evelyn lunging across the coffee table, her face twisted into a mask of pure venom, screaming that I was a weak, pathetic weed. They had spent 34 years cultivating my fear. They had watered it, pruned it, and expected it to bear the fruit of my endless submission. They thought my silence was the absence of strength. They did not understand the desert. In the arid wastelands, survival requires a ruthless economy of energy. The most resilient plants do not waste their resources producing loud, vibrant displays of dominance. They grow deep roots. They hoard their strength in the dark, waiting patiently for the exact moment the environment shifts. When the flash flood finally arrives, the quiet desert consumes everything in its path. I opened my eyes. The fragile, grieving daughter they had tried to manipulate was dead. The woman sitting in the subterranean bank vault was the sole architect of their destruction. Harrison unclipped a sleek gold-nibbed fountain pen from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He held it out toward me across the mahogany table. I reached forward. My fingers closed around the smooth, heavy metal barrel. My pulse was a slow, steady drum beat. There was no tremor in my hand. There was no hesitation in my chest. I pressed the gold nib against the thick parchment paper. The dark blue ink flowed effortlessly across the signature line, binding my name to the trust, to the wealth, and to the lethal corporate leverage Sylvia had forged in the dark. I picked up the pen. Without a single moment of hesitation, I signed my name, sealing my family's absolute financial ruin. The ink on the parchment dried, binding the legal machinery of the trust into a devastating reality. The fallout from the sting operation was instantaneous and spectacular. It swept through the arid New Mexico landscape like a sudden violent wildfire, consuming the fragile architecture of my family's fraudulent empire. The criminal justice system moved with an efficiency reserved for undeniable felonies, denied bail due to the severity of the charges and the overwhelming weight of the video evidence. Evelyn, Richard, and Julian were remanded to the county detention center. They were locked in concrete cells, stripped of their designer wardrobes, their cell phones, and the social armor they had relied on to manipulate the world. But the true devastation did not occur inside the courthouse. It unfolded in the quiet, sterile offices of corporate liquidators and foreclosure attorneys. Acting as the sole executive of Sylvia's irrevocable trust, I assumed control of the newly formed shell companies holding my family's debt. I wielded my grandmother's capital like a scalpel, adhering strictly to the botanical principle she had taught me inside the sweltering greenhouse decades ago. You do not negotiate with the infection. You do not apply a gentle bandage. You carve deep into the tissue and cut away the rot completely, discarding the diseased material without a single shred of regret. I did not grant them a grace period. I did not offer a settlement. 48 hours after I signed the executive documents, I instructed Harrison Reed to trigger the default clauses hidden deep within the fine print of my family's financial contracts. The execution was ruthless. Julian's tech startup collapsed in a matter of days. As the primary secured creditor, I initiated an aggressive corporate liquidation. The federal agents who had been circling his fraudulent server farms swooped in to pick the bones clean. The servers were seized. The office leases were terminated. The illusion of the brilliant, untouchable tech prodigy shattered, leaving behind nothing but empty bank accounts and a mountain of federal indictments. Richard and Evelyn fared no better. The 3 overlapping mortgages securing their sprawling Mediterranean mansion had been structured on a house of cards. The moment they missed the emergency balloon payment, I authorized the immediate foreclosure. The bank did not hesitate. A team of local sheriffs arrived at the gated community serving the eviction notices to the empty house. The expensive sports cars were repossessed from the circular driveway. The manicured, water-wasting lawns turned brown and brittle under the scorching desert sun. The bank seized the property, wiping out my parents' entire net worth before they even stepped into a courtroom for their preliminary arraignment. 2 weeks later, I walked through the heavy glass doors of the Bernal-Leo County Courthouse. The air inside the municipal building was stale and cool, smelling faintly of floor wax and anxious sweat. I bypassed the crowded lobby and walked down the long linoleum corridor toward Department 4. The heavy wooden double doors swung open, granting me access to the gallery. I sat in the back row. The wooden bench was hard and uncomfortable. I folded my hands in my lap, maintaining a posture of calm, unbroken stillness. The courtroom was sparsely populated. A few board reporters scribbled notes in the press box, drawn by the salacious details of a wealthy family tearing itself apart over an inheritance. The bailiff barked in order, and the heavy side door near the judge's bench clicked open. My family shuffled into the harsh fluorescent light. The transformation was absolute. The arrogant, untouchable predators who had marched into my apartment to drug and extort me no longer existed. They were dressed in oversized, shapeless orange jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound in heavy steel transport chains. The metallic clinking echoed loudly against the acoustic tiles. Richard walked with a pronounced hunch. His broad shoulders collapsed inward. The executive dominance had drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, unhealthy gray. He kept his eyes locked firmly onto the scuffed linoleum floor, lacking the courage to survey the gallery. Julian looked like a frightened child. His expensive haircut had grown out into a greasy, unkempt mess. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, darting frantically around the room as if searching for a hidden exit. The sheer gravity of the federal fraud charges and the attempted extortion had broken his spirit completely. Evelyn walked behind them. The matriarch who had orchestrated the slow execution of her mother-in-law. The woman who had lunged across a glass table to tear my throat out looked small and fragile. Her pristine salon-styled hair was pulled back into a severe messy knot. The harsh prison lighting highlighted the deep, sharp lines of age and exhaustion etched around her mouth. They were guided to the defense table, their public defenders hovering nearby. The high-priced corporate litigators Richard had always threatened to unleash were nowhere to be found. A frozen bank account guarantees a very swift transition to state-appointed counsel. The judge called the case to order. The bureaucratic drone of the preliminary hearing commenced. The prosecutor listed the charges with clinical detachment. Aggravated assault. Attempted extortion. Conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The pending homicide investigation regarding Sylvia's toxicology report hung over the proceedings like a dark, suffocating cloud. Evelyn turned her head, scanning the rows of wooden benches in the gallery. Her gaze swept past the reporters and the sleepy court clerks. Her eyes found me. She froze. The defense attorney beside her murmured a question. But she did not respond. She stared at me across the vast expanse of the courtroom. The venom and the hatred that had distorted her features in my apartment were gone. The manipulative, sweet maternal mask she used to control Richard was entirely absent. All that remained was raw, unfiltered desperation. She knew the truth. She knew the Mediterranean mansion was foreclosed. She knew the bank accounts were seized. She knew the rot had been completely excised from the healthy stem. Evelyn raised her chained hands slightly, resting them against the edge of the wooden defense table. She held my gaze, her eyes welling with tears, her lips parted. Without producing a single sound, she mouthed a single desperate word. Please. It was the ultimate surrender. The apex predator was begging the quiet, fragile weed for mercy. I did not blink. I did not frown. My face remained a flawless mask of serene botanical indifference. I had spent 34 years shrinking myself to accommodate their massive toxic egos. I had swallowed their condescension, endured their manipulation, and survived their lethal traps. The well of my empathy was completely dry. I stood up from the hard wooden bench. The movement was slow and deliberate. Evelyn watched me, a flicker of frantic hope igniting in her tear-filled eyes. She thought I was going to walk toward the wooden railing. She thought I was going to approach the defense table and offer her a lifeline. I turned my back to her. I walked down the narrow center aisle, the heels of my boots clicking. A steady rhythmic exit against the linoleum. I did not look back at Richard. I did not glance at Julian. I pushed the heavy wooden double doors open and stepped out of the courtroom, leaving them locked inside the machinery of their own destruction. I walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the blinding New Mexico sun. The desert heat hit my skin like a physical embrace, baking away the stale, refrigerated air of the municipal building. The sky above Albuquerque was a brilliant cloudless blue. The dry wind swept off the mesa, carrying the faint, bitter scent of wild sage and sun-baked earth. I reached deep into the pocket of my denim jacket. My fingers closed around the heavy brass keys to Sylvia's adobe estate. The metal felt warm against my palm. The weight of the keys did not represent a burden. They represented absolute untouchable sovereignty. The trap had sprung. The debt was collected. The rot was gone. I walked toward my truck, the silence of the desert welcoming me home. 2 years later, the dry wind sweeping across the mesa carried the scent of blooming oosio and damp earth. I stood on the wide stone patio of the adobe estate, watching the morning sun illuminate the sprawling acreage. The tension that had governed the posture of my shoulders for 3 decades was gone. The rigid defensive stance I had adopted to survive my family had softened into a natural, grounded stillness. The desert was wide and open, and for the first time in my life, I belonged to it. The property did not look like the sterile, manicured lawns of my parents' former gated community. It was a thriving, untamed sanctuary. Beyond the patio, a complex network of narrow irrigation trenches carved precise geometric patterns into the soil. The water flowing through those channels came directly from the vast subterranean aquifer hidden deep beneath the bedrock. Julian had intended to drain that ancient reservoir dry. He wanted to pump millions of gallons of cold water to the surface to cool rows of flashing computer servers, sacrificing the ecological balance of the land to appease his corporate investors. He viewed the water as a raw commodity. I knew it was the lifeblood of the desert. I had refused every lucrative offer from the corporate developers who circled the estate following the criminal trials. The mineral deeds and water rights remained locked inside the irrevocable trust. Instead of selling the land, I used my grandmother's capital and my botanical expertise to cultivate an oasis. The estate now functioned as a fully funded agricultural refuge. It provided safe, long-term housing for women escaping domestic violence and financial abuse. The residential cottages sat quietly under the shade of ancient cartonwood trees. The women who lived here arrived with frozen bank accounts, shattered credit scores, and the lingering trauma of manipulative predators. They arrived looking exactly the way I had felt sitting in my dim apartment 2 years ago. Here they found autonomy in the soil. They learned how to graft fruit trees, harvest heirloom vegetables, and propagate native desert flora. They drew a steady independent salary funded by the trust. They rebuilt their lives away from the loud, demanding voices of the people who had tried to crush them. I walked down the gravel path, listening to the rhythmic, soothing hum of the deep well pump. A young woman named Sarah knelt near a row of vibrant green pepper plants. She was carefully tying the heavy vines to wooden stakes. When she noticed me walking past, she offered a genuine, unforced smile. I nodded in return. We did not need to fill the morning air with hollow chatter. The quiet companionship of shared labor was enough. I continued down the long driveway toward the main road. The row iron gates stood open, welcoming the warm morning breeze. A row of heavy metal mailboxes sat mounted on a wooden post near the edge of the asphalt. I reached the end of the drive and pulled open the small metal door of my designated box. Inside rested a modest stack of daily correspondence. There were a few glossy seed catalogues, a quarterly tax statement for the agricultural charity, and a thick bundle of hardware store flyers. Tucked near the bottom of the pile was a plain white envelope. I pulled the stack of mail into the sunlight and slid the white envelope out from the center. The paper was cheap and thin. The return address printed in the upper left corner bore the stark official seal of the federal penitentiary located 300 mi away in Texas. The handwriting sprawling across the center of the envelope was erratic and rushed. The cursive loops were sloppy, written by a hand that trembled with constant anxiety. It was from Julian. It was not his first attempt at contact. Over the past 24 months, the letters had arrived with predictable regularity. The initial envelopes had been thick, filled with pages of frantic apologies and desperate pleas for forgiveness. He blamed Evelyn for everything. He claimed he was a victim of her manipulation. When the apologies failed to draw a response, the tone of the letters shifted into bitter resentment. Now the correspondence had dwindled to a singular pathetic purpose. I did not need to open the envelope to know what was written on the single sheet of lined paper inside. He was begging for a deposit into his prison commissary account. The arrogant tech CEO who had once tried to steal an empire was now reduced to pleading for pocket change to buy instant coffee and packaged snacks behind concrete walls. I held the envelope between my thumb and forefinger. I felt no anger. The biting hot rage that had fueled my survival during the sting operation had burned out long ago. I felt no pity either. The well of sisterly obligation had run permanently dry the moment he uncapped that glass vial in my kitchen. Looking at his messy handwriting, I felt only a mild clinical detachment. He was just a ghost haunting a mailbox. I turned around and walked back up the gravel driveway. I entered the main adobe house, passing through the quiet foyer and stepping into the expansive study. This was the same room where Richard had frantically torn through filing cabinets and where Evelyn had weaponized her counterfeit maternal warmth. The chaotic debris of their invasion was a distant memory. The study was now a clean, organized administrative office. I walked over to the heavy oak desk. Sitting on the floor near the wastebasket was a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder. I did not break the seal on Julian's letter. I did not pause to wonder if this specific envelope contained a genuine revelation or a final confession. I pressed the power button on the machine. The steel gears ground to life with a steady mechanical hum. I fed the unopened white envelope directly into the narrow metal slot. The sharp blades caught the cheap paper, pulling it downward in a fraction of a second. The letter was instantly pulverized into hundreds of tiny, illegible white ribbons. The shredded confetti dropped into the plastic bin below, joining the remains of old receipts and junk mail. I turned the machine off. The room returned to its peaceful silence. I left the study and walked across the stone patio, heading toward the glass greenhouse. The thick door swung open smoothly. The heavy deadbolt that Julianne had used to trap me in the sweltering heat had been permanently removed. The air inside the glass structure was warm and deeply fragrant, smelling of damp potting soil, blooming jasmine, and rich desert earth. I walked to the small wooden preparation table near the back wall. An electric kettle sat next to a ceramic teapot. I flipped the switch, listening to the water heat to a rapid boil. I placed a pinch of loose black tea leaves into a ceramic mug and poured the steaming water over the rim. The dark liquid swirled in the cup. I did not reach into my pocket for a sprig of desert sage. I did not need to test the chemical composition of the water. I knew exactly who had poured it. The tea was pure. The environment was secure. I picked up the warm ceramic mug and walked to the far corner of the greenhouse. I sat down on an overturned wooden crate, letting the steam rise against my face. Directly in front of me sat the massive terracotta basin holding the agave americana. The towering century plant looked vastly different than it had 2 years ago. The majestic, life-giving flower that had bloomed at the top of the stalk had dropped its seeds and withered away. The towering main stem was now a dry, brittle husk of dead wood. The thick, spiky leaves that had once stored decades of water had collapsed into brown, decaying ribbons. The mother plant had sacrificed everything it possessed, expending all its stored energy to secure the next generation before succumbing to its natural end. I took a slow sip of the hot tea. The rich, earthy flavor settled my senses. I lowered the mug and looked closely at the dark soil near the base of the dead agave, right in the exact spot where I had clawed through the dirt to unearth Sylvia's coated journal and the brass safe deposit key. The earth was shifting, pushing up through the damp soil. Surrounded by the decaying remnants of the old roots was a brand new agave pup. The young plant was small, but its architecture was flawless. The tiny, thick leaves were a vibrant, vivid green. The sharp spines along the edges were already rigid and defined. It was drawing nutrients from the soil, anchoring its roots deep into the earth, preparing to store its own water for the long decades ahead. It was thriving in the exact space where the rot had been cut away. I rested my hands on my knees, listening to the faint melodic sound of the irrigation water flowing through the trenches outside the glass walls. The desert does not rush. It does not boast. It simply waits, adapting to the harsh realities of the climate, quietly outlasting the loud, violent storms that threaten to wash it away. Loud greed will always destroy itself. But quiet, observant strength endures. The audio fades out on the sound of running water and absolute peace. There is a profound and heavy silence that settles over the desert just before the dawn. It is a stillness that forces you to listen to the things you normally ignore. When we reflect on the journey of Marbell John and the shattered legacy of her family, the true tragedy does not lie in the foreclosed mansions or the lost millions. The real tragedy is rooted deep in the soil of how we raise our children. In modern American culture, we are often sold a very specific, polished image of the successful traditional family. We picture the sprawling home in the gated community, the pristine lawns, and the children who boast impressive resumes and shiny startups. We are conditioned to measure our parenting by the loud visible milestones of prosperity. But beneath that flawless veneer, we have to ask ourselves what we are actually watering. What seeds are we planting in the minds of the people who will inherit our world when we are gone? Evelyn and Richard built their family on a foundation of performance and conditional love. They taught their son Julian that ambition justified any moral compromise. They raised him to believe that taking up space, demanding resources, and prioritizing his own survival over the well-being of others was the exact definition of strength. They poured all their validation into the child who mirrored their own unchecked greed. At the same time, they looked at their daughter Mabel and saw only a quiet convenience. They mistook her introverted nature for submission. They failed to recognize the deep observant intelligence growing in the shadows of their own home. This is a failure of emotional awareness that plagues so many households today. When parents prioritize the loud child who brings them superficial status over the quiet child who requires genuine connection, they fracture the traditional family structure. They teach the golden child entitlement and they teach the invisible child resentment. But Mabel did not become resentful. She became resilient. And she learned that resilience not from her parents but from her grandmother. Sylvia understood the true weight of long-term family responsibility. Parenting does not end when a child turns 18. And it is not limited to biological mothers and fathers. Genuine guidance requires the courage to look at your own bloodline with unclouded honesty. Sylvia loved her son, Richard. But she did not blind herself to his profound flaws. She saw the sickness spreading through her family tree. Instead of enabling it under the false guise of unconditional loyalty, she took extraordinary measures to protect the healthy branch. She taught Mabel the harsh, beautiful truths of the natural world. She taught her how to graft a desert cactus, explaining that sometimes you must carve away the diseased tissue to save the plant. That is the ultimate act of parental love. It is the willingness to make agonizing, unpopular choices to ensure the next generation survives with their integrity intact. Sylvia modeled fairness not by dividing her estate equally among the greedy and the deserving, but by ensuring that true value was placed in the hands of the one person who respected it. She understood that leaving a legacy of wealth to a child without a moral compass is like handing a lit match to an arsonist. It will only end in their own destruction. In a society that often rewards the loudest voice in the room, raising a child with deep emotional awareness is an act of quiet rebellion. It requires us to sit down with our children and teach them that their worth is not tied to their bank accounts or their job titles. It means showing them that true strength is found in patience, observation, and the refusal to compromise one's honesty for a convenient shortcut. Evelyn and Richard treated honesty as a burden. They built a house of cards on forged signatures, toxic loans, and lethal deception. They forgot that children are the ultimate mirrors. Julian became a predator because he was raised by one. He ended up begging for commissary money in a federal penitentiary because his parents never taught him the value of honest labor or the basic principles of human empathy. We must ask ourselves what we are modeling for the young eyes watching us every single day. Are we teaching them to be the parasitic vine that drains the host? Or are we teaching them to be the deep root that sustains life? Breaking a toxic generational cycle is the hardest work a person can do. It requires you to mourn the family you deserved while fighting the family you were given. Mabel had to become the sole architect of her own rescue. But she was only able to do it because Sylvia left her the blueprint. If this story resonates with you, if you have ever had to navigate the painful reality of a toxic household or found your own quiet strength in the shadows of someone else's ego, you are not alone. There is a community here that understands the heavy cost of cutting away the rot to save yourself. Please subscribe and follow the Revenge Order channel for more stories about resilience, justice, and the quiet power of outsmarting the predators in your life. Share your own experiences in the comments below because your personal story of survival might be the exact guide someone else needs to hear today. The agave plant spends its entire life gathering energy, storing water in its thick leaves, enduring the blistering heat and the freezing nights. It does not boast. It simply prepares. And when the time is right, it produces something magnificent, leaving behind a new generation before it fades back into the earth. When Mabel sat in that greenhouse sipping her tea and watching the new agave pup push through the soil, she was looking at the physical manifestation of her grandmother's guidance. She was looking at the enduring result of brutal honesty and unwavering family responsibility. We are all planting seeds in the dark. We are all leaving a legacy behind, whether it is written in a legal trust or etched into the emotional memories of our children. The question is not whether our children will grow. The question is what they will become when the drought arrives and the easy water dries up. Will they wither under the pressure, turning on each other to survive? Or will they draw from a deep hidden well of character that we helped them build? Look closely at the people sitting around your dinner table tonight. Look at the quiet ones. Look at the loud ones. The future is already taking root right in front of you. What kind of harvest are you preparing for?